What if love weren't something that begins, but something that returns? What if certain emotions weren't born at the moment we feel them, but merely awakened, like something that had been asleep, waiting for the right body to continue existing? What if destiny weren't a straight line, but a patient circle, slowly turning until it finds someone willing to repeat the same gesture once again? What if some houses weren't built to shelter people, but to store feelings no one ever had the courage to bury? What if there were places that do not forget, that do not forgive time, that do not accept endings, and that, for that very reason, learn how to call back everything that tries to leave? There are questions that arise only when the silence is deep enough. Questions that don't ask for immediate answers because they know the answer hurts. Questions that present themselves as curiosity but hide a warning. Warnings that arrive too late for those who have already walked through the wrong door. What if the kiss you give today is nothing more than the exact continuation of a kiss given decades ago, in the same place, with the same unspoken promise, but with different people? What if the love you feel isn't entirely yours? What if someone loved here before you with such force that they left marks in the air, in the walls and the floor, marks that now recognize your footsteps as if they were an old habit? Because there are loves that belong to people, and there are loves that belong to places. The narrator of this story learned, too late, that memory does not live only inside the mind. It learns to dwell where it was felt most intensely. It learns to hide in long corridors, in worn staircases, in windows that creak when the wind blows just right. It learns how to wait. The mansion, because every story like this needs a name too large to fit into a simple word, did not announce itself as something special. There were no signs, no legends spoken out loud, no curious tourists. It existed the way certain old pains exist. Everyone knows they're there, but no one wants to touch them directly. From a distance, the house looked merely old, too large to ignore, too ancient to desire. Surrounded by tall trees whose branches touched high above like interlaced fingers, it always seemed wrapped in its own shadow, regardless of the sun. Not a dark shadow, but a dense one, as if the air around it were heavier. The road to the mansion wasn't difficult, but it was long. Long in a strange way, as if time stretched itself along the path. The car moved forward, but the sensation was slow, almost ceremonial. The wind that slipped through the cracks carried the scent of wet earth, old leaves, and something indefinable, an odor that was neither exactly mold nor exactly perfume, but memory. The gate, when it appeared, caused no impact. It did not want to impress. It was made of old iron, rusted in irregular patches, like skin marked by years of exposure. The sound it made when pushed wasn't loud, but it was deep, as if it rose from inside the ground. A sound not easily forgotten. Crossing it, the narrator felt something they couldn't name at the time. It wasn't fear, it wasn't excitement, it was recognition. A brief, precise sensation, like entering a new place and for one impossible second, being absolutely certain you've been there before. The mansion did not welcome the narrator with grandeur. It welcomed them with silence. The entrance hall was wide but not imposing. The dark wooden floor creaked underfoot, not aggressively, but almost respectfully, as if warning that it was awake. The walls were high, covered in old faded wallpaper, showing small imperfections time had made no effort to hide. The light that entered through the windows was filtered by heavy curtains, creating a soft, aged glow. The smell inside was different from the outside world. It was the smell of accumulated time, wood, fabric, fine dust, and far beneath it all, a floral perfume so faint it could be mistaken for imagination, if it didn't return so many times afterward. The narrator did not arrive there out of courage. They arrived out of exhaustion, a tiredness that rest cannot cure because it doesn't live in the body, a weariness of life, of repeated choices, of internal noise that never quiets. The mansion seemed to offer exactly that: isolation, silence, room to breathe. What the narrator didn't know, and perhaps no one knows when they cross certain doors, is that some places do not offer rest, they offer continuity. It was there, among still-closed suitcases and windows whose openness felt undecided, that the presence of the other began to feel constant, not as an invasion, but as a natural extension of the space. Someone who moved through the house with unsettling ease, someone who seemed to know where to step, where to avoid, where silence was required. There was something comforting in that presence, something that warmed the mansion from the inside, a discreet care, a quiet attentiveness, a closeness that asked for no explanation. The narrator clung to it without realizing it, because when a place is too cold, any gesture of tenderness feels like salvation. Love, when it began, did not ask permission. It settled in slowly, like everything that seems harmless at first, a casual touch that lingered longer than it should, a gaze that stayed 1 second beyond necessity, a presence that began to be anticipated before it was even noticed. And when the first kiss happened, simple, silent, almost shy, the narrator felt something change around them, not inside, around. The air grew denser. The silence seemed to lean closer. The mansion, for the first time, appeared to pay attention, as if it had recognized an old gesture, as if it had just remembered something it never forgot, and somewhere invisible within the house, something seemed to awaken, not in haste, not in anger, but with the patience of something that knows exactly what comes next. What if there is a kind of longing that belongs to no one alive, yet continues to circulate like trapped wind? What if what we call a place's atmosphere is not just temperature and humidity, but a sum of old goodbyes time failed to dissolve? What if certain promises are so intense they become architecture? The narrator had always suspected that there were houses where life does not end the same way, not literally but humanly, places where emotions remain like stains in fabric, hard to remove, visible only when the light hits at the right angle. Sometimes it takes very little to feel this: a corridor that's too cold, a room that smells of perfume with no bottles in sight, a staircase that creaks as if complaining when used. The mansion seemed built to store exactly that kind of thing. Not an ordinary past, but a persistent one, a past that refuses to be merely past. The kiss, which should have been just an intimate moment between two people, initiated a series of small changes in daily life. Nothing spectacular. Nothing that could be pointed to as proof, just signs. The kind the body notices before the mind accepts. The narrator realized that after that kiss, the interior of the house became more sensitive. The floor creaked less in certain corridors, as if satisfied. In others, it creaked more, as if protesting. There was a strange selectivity to it, as if the mansion chose which paths to approve and which to warn against. The light seemed to change as well, not because of the sun's position, but because of how brightness behaved as it crossed the glass. In the morning, the mansion remained pale, almost gray. But at dusk, the shadows deepened, and the interior began to feel like a space from another time, as if the house preferred that hour for reasons that weren't meteorological. They were emotional. The floral scent, once a faint detail, began to appear in discrete waves, especially when the narrator was alone. It wasn't a perfume that recalled stores or freshly cut flowers. It felt like skin, like someone who had passed through and left a trace of themselves in the air. And most disturbing of all, the scent carried feeling. It wasn't neutral. It was a blend of tenderness and possession. The narrator tried to convince themselves it was imagination, the effect of an old house, interference from the weather. But there was one detail imagination struggled to explain. The perfume appeared almost precisely, always in the same places, always at specific moments, as if responding to inner states. When the narrator thought about leaving, the scent came. When they thought about the kiss, the scent came. When they felt afraid of losing the other, the scent came. It was as if the house heard thoughts no one should hear. The other remained present, and the relationship grew with a naturalness that felt impossible in such a charged setting. That was precisely what made it more dangerous. The tenderness was real. The gestures were not staged. There was care in placing a blanket over the narrator's shoulders on a cold night. There was attentiveness in preparing a more comfortable space in the living room when the rain dragged on. There was closeness in how the other moved through the environment, as if the mansion were an extension of their own body. And the narrator began to realize that this familiarity wasn't simple habit, it was ancestral intimacy. There were things too small to be coincidence. The way the other avoided, stepping on certain spots on the floor, as if knowing exactly where a creak would betray presence. The way they closed windows before the rain even began, as if anticipating the weather. The way they fell silent when passing portraits, certain corridors, doors the narrator hadn't even noticed yet. Love in this context was a difficult light, a light that, when it illuminated, revealed shadows that hadn't been visible before. And the narrator began to wonder whether the mansion tolerated that light out of generosity, or whether it needed it to reactivate something. The small town around it seemed to live under an unspoken pact of silence. The narrator began walking the streets more, trying to feel the emotional temperature of the place. People greeted kindly, but avoided prolonged conversation. Eyes shifted when the mansion was mentioned. There were names that were not spoken, stories that were cut short before they began. The narrator noticed it in the details, the way the bakery attendant stiffened slightly upon hearing the address, the way an old man at the market made the sign of the cross discreetly when referring to that house. It wasn't blatant superstition, it was survival habit, like people who had learned not to poke old wounds. It was on one of those walks, on a late afternoon when the sky felt heavy and the town smelled of dust about to turn into mud, that the narrator found the first external sign that the mansion was not just an old property. In the central square, near a worn wooden bench, there was a community bulletin board. Among event invitations and service offers, there was an old photograph pinned with a rusted thumbtack. The image showed the mansion, clearly the same one, at a time when the garden was better kept and the windows looked less tired. At the bottom of the photo was a nearly illegible handwritten caption. The narrator stepped closer and managed to decipher only a fragment. Missing, and a name that seemed to have been erased or intentionally faded. The narrator felt their body stiffen, not with fear but with pattern recognition. The disappearance wasn't an isolated event, it was part of a larger story. When they returned home, the mansion was unusually quiet, as if listening. The interior smelled faintly of flowers, and the floor in the hall creaked at a specific point, as if marking presence. On the sideboard, where the old key had once been, there was now something else, a small handkerchief made of fine fabric, carefully folded, as if placed there to be found. The handkerchief had delicate embroidery and, in one corner, initials, 2 letters stitched in dark thread. The narrator didn't recognize the initials, but the other, upon entering the hall and seeing the handkerchief, paused for a second too long. Their face didn't show panic, but something worse, memory. In that instant, the narrator felt the definitive transition into Act 1 open like a door that didn't creak. It felt like entering a forbidden place within the place itself, as if, from that handkerchief onward, it was no longer possible to pretend everything was just atmosphere. The mansion was not offering clues at random. It was guiding someone toward a name that did not want to remain buried, and deep down, very deep, a sound almost musical seemed to pass through the walls. A long, slow note as if someone, somewhere that should not exist, was remembering a kiss. Routine began to take shape as if it had been rehearsed long before the narrator's arrival. There was no rush to the days inside the mansion. Time seemed to accept only one rhythm, slow, continuous, repetitive enough to create familiarity. The narrator always woke with the feeling that the house was already awake, as if it had spent the entire night in silent vigil. In the morning, the light entered cautiously, never directly, never abundantly. It was a filtered, aged light, touching the furniture as if asking permission. The smell of coffee blended with that of old wood, creating an atmosphere that was almost domestic, almost safe, and it was precisely in that almost that the danger lived. The mansion offered just enough comfort to lower one's guard, but never enough to allow complete forgetting. The other became part of that routine with unsettling naturalness. There was a practical knowledge of the space that went far beyond recent learning. The narrator noticed how certain gestures seemed automatic, opening a specific window at the exact hour to avoid moisture, leaving a door half open during the day, closing that same door completely when night fell. None of this was explained. None of it was announced. It simply happened. Love deepened in those details. There were no dramatic declarations. There was coexistence. There was constant presence. There was an intimacy built from shared silences and small attentions. The narrator felt that the bond was real, and perhaps because of that, the mansion became more active. Old places do not like being ignored when something new threatens to occupy the emotional center. Outside, the town continued to function as a distant backdrop. The narrator went to the market, walked the narrow streets, observed the same faces repeating themselves at the same hours. There was a sense of permanence there that matched the mansion too well, as if the entire region had been shaped by the same refusal to move fully forward. Conversations with residents were always polite, but filled with gaps. Simple questions met evasive answers. Any mention of the mansion was followed by a brief, uncomfortable silence, as if everyone shared an unspoken agreement that is not discussed. The narrator began to realize that true isolation did not come from distance from the town, but from the collective pact of forgetting. Inside the house, certain spaces began to stand out. A narrow side corridor where the air always felt colder, a service staircase that creaked even when no one used it, a room at the back of the ground floor that remained permanently closed, though the narrator had never seen a corresponding key. Together, these details created the feeling that the mansion did not offer itself whole. It revealed itself in parts as it deemed necessary. The narrator also began to notice subtle changes in their own emotional state. There were moments of causeless melancholy, as if an old sadness had been awakened. There were also moments of intense, almost painful tenderness, as if the love lived there carried an urgency that could not be explained by the present alone. It was as though every gesture was crossed by the awareness that something was being compared. The floral perfume returned with growing regularity. It did not invade, it suggested. Always at the same times, always in the same places, near the main staircase, in the side corridor, close to a door the narrator had not yet opened. It was a scent that did not demand direct attention, but insisted on being noticed. A constant reminder of a presence unseen, yet felt. One morning, the narrator found something different on the kitchen table, an old glass cup, with small imperfections in the material, placed carefully beside the coffee maker. It was not an object the narrator used. It was not an object the other usually used. Still, there it was, clean, positioned with intention. When the narrator touched it, they felt a localized cold, accompanied by a brief sensation of expectation, as if someone were waiting for that glass to be used again after a very long time. The other, upon noticing the glass, said nothing. They simply returned it to a specific cabinet in the back, as one would return something to its proper place. That simple gesture gave the narrator an uncomfortable certainty. There were things in that house that had fixed places for a very long time, and when those places were disturbed, the mansion reacted. At night, the sounds became more present, not louder, but more organized. Creaks in sequence, spaced cracks, a distant noise that resembled light footsteps, always on the upper floor, always beyond sight. The narrator did not feel immediate panic. They felt observation, as if they were being evaluated, not as a threat, but as a possibility. Love in that context became more intense and more fragile at the same time. There was an almost constant closeness between the two, as if both knew the time there was unreliable. The narrator began to notice a recurring melancholy in the other's gaze, not a present sadness, but an anticipated one, as if they already knew the endings of similar stories. It was on a silent afternoon, while the narrator organized an old bookshelf in the main living room, that they found the first object impossible to ignore. Among old books and forgotten papers, there was a small, loose photograph without a frame. The image showed the mansion, but not empty. There were people on the veranda. A woman stood out, leaning on the railing, looking directly at the camera. The face was not unfamiliar. It was the same face from the perfume, from the handkerchief, from the persistent sense of comparison. The woman did not look surprised to be photographed. She looked confident. She looked as if she knew she would be remembered. On the back of the photo, written in firm handwriting, there was only a short sentence, "I stay." The narrator felt their body cool slowly, because in that instant, they understood something essential. The mansion was not merely keeping memories, it was keeping promises, and promises, when they are not fulfilled, learn how to wait. The sentence on the back of the photograph lingered in the narrator like a metallic taste, insistent, difficult to forget. "I stay." Two simple words that, in any other circumstance, might sound like mere romanticism or stubbornness. Inside that mansion, however, they sounded like a vow made to the very structure of the world, a vow that perhaps had not been fulfilled as it should have been, and that, for that reason, still echoed. The narrator tried to put the photo away, but the sense that it did not want to be hidden was clear. Objects inside that house seemed to carry will, not through explicit magic, but through an emotional weight so old it became almost physical. When the narrator placed the photograph on the table, they had the impression that the room's light itself leaned toward it, as if the space wanted to keep it visible. The other entered the room shortly after. Upon seeing the photo, they stopped. It was not a theatrical shock. It was a brief freeze, almost imperceptible, accompanied by a shift in the eyes, as if a memory that had been carefully locked away had been struck from within. The narrator waited for some reaction, denial, explanation, explicit discomfort. But what came was a heavy stillness, a stillness that said more than words. The narrator realized there were things the other knew and did not want to say, not out of deceit but out of protection, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of guilt. And that made the relationship even more delicate. Loving someone who carries an old secret is always also loving the distance that secret creates. In the days that followed, the mansion intensified its small invitations. It was as if, after the encounter with the photograph, it had decided to accelerate remembrance. The floral perfume appeared earlier, sometimes still in the morning, especially when the narrator passed near the side corridor on the second floor. And there was a new detail. The scent came with a specific sensation of presence, as if someone were only a few steps away, breathing at the same rhythm. The narrator began to go upstairs more often, not out of courage but out of necessity. When a place insists on being seen, resistance requires energy, and the narrator was too tired to fight their own curiosity. The side corridor was narrow and colder, with wallpaper peeling in strips. There were damp stains that looked like abstract drawings, maps of something no one had deciphered. The silence there was different, deeper, more concentrated. The narrator felt that corridor was not merely part of the house, it was a limit, a boundary. At its end, one door drew attention by the way it remained intact. While other doors showed wear, this one seemed less touched, as if someone had made a point of preserving access. The handle was cold metal, marked with small scratches, signs of old, repeated use. When the narrator touched, they felt an immediate shiver, accompanied by a brief image in the mind, feminine fingers gripping that same handle, hesitating, as if they knew that opening that door meant crossing a point of no return. The narrator hesitated, not out of fear of finding something horrible, but out of fear of confirming something inevitable. There are discoveries that do not terrify, but change the way one breathes. Still, the door opened. The room beyond seemed to exist outside of time. The light was always dim, filtered through heavy curtains. The air was still, as if it were rarely renewed. There was a narrow bed with a light bedspread, carefully arranged, a vanity with objects aligned with precision, a closed wardrobe with such a strong sense of presence that it felt wrong to touch it. Nothing there was abandoned. Everything was preserved. The narrator entered slowly, feeling as though they were intruding on something too intimate to be just a room. The floral perfume there was stronger, but also sadder. It was the scent of someone who had waited too long. On the vanity lay a set of items arranged as if they had been left the night before. A wooden hairbrush, a dark ribbon dried by time, and an oval locket. The narrator touched the locket and felt a wave of emotion rush through their body with such force that they had to brace themselves against the vanity. It was not their emotion. It was longing. It was fear. It was jealousy. It was a love so intense it seemed to have been compressed into that object and preserved for decades. The narrator opened the locket and found the photograph, the same woman, the same gaze, now even closer, even more intimate. Beside the locket was an old envelope, sealed with cracked wax. The narrator did not break the seal immediately. They simply held the envelope, feeling the texture of the paper, as if touch itself were already a form of reading. Still, curiosity won. The seal was broken carefully. Inside was a long letter, written in firm handwriting. The narrator read slowly, feeling each sentence as a voiceless voice. The letter spoke of love, yes, but above all it spoke of promise. It spoke of the fear of being replaced by someone who would come later. It spoke of the desire to remain bound to the mansion as a way of never being forgotten. And there was a passage that made the narrator stop, because it seemed to look directly into the present. When you arrive, you will think you love freely, but the house will remember me through you. The narrator felt their stomach tighten. The letter did not seem written for a specific recipient. It seemed written for the future, for someone who did not yet exist in the author's world, for someone who would occupy the place of after. Before they could continue, the narrator heard a sound in the corridor, footsteps, calm, familiar, stopping at the threshold of the open door. The narrator did not turn around immediately. They already knew who was there, and they felt, with icy clarity, that this discovery was not an accident. The mansion had guided the narrator to that room, and now it waited for a reaction. The silence that settled at the threshold of that room was heavier than any verbal confession could have been. The narrator felt that, at that point, words would be inadequate. The truth was already whole in the air, condensed, dense, impossible to undo with belated explanations. The mansion seemed to know this. It always knew when to remain silent. The other's presence in the corridor did not advance. There was no attempt to stop the reading of the letter, nor to reclaim the locket, nor to justify the preserved room. There was only staying, a tired, almost resigned staying, like someone who carries a secret too large to keep pretending it does not exist, but too heavy to hand over all at once. The narrator felt that reaction said everything. The room was not a surprise. The woman in the photograph was not unknown. The letter was not merely a remnant of the past. All of it was part of a structure the other knew intimately, perhaps forever, even if they had never consciously chosen to carry that knowledge. When leaving the room, the narrator felt clearly that they were crossing an invisible line. There was no emotional return possible to the initial innocence. Love was now contaminated by context, and context changes everything. What once felt spontaneous now seemed inserted into an old script, repeated with minimal variations over time. That night, the mansion did not sleep. The narrator sensed this not through excessive noise, but through sonic order. The creaks occurred at regular intervals, like measured steps. The internal wind moved through the corridors always in the same direction, as if testing routes. The floral perfume appeared and disappeared with almost mathematical precision, as if someone were experimenting with how close they could come without being rejected. The narrator tried to sleep, but sleep came in fragments. Between one waking and the next, images rose with disturbing clarity. They weren't ordinary dreams. They were organized sequences, memories that did not belong to the narrator, but were now offered as an involuntary loan. The narrator saw old parties in the mansion, candlelight reflecting in polished glass, saw the young woman descending the staircase in a pale dress, gripping the banister at the exact spot where the narrator now rested a hand, saw kisses exchanged in the same place where the narrator had kissed the other only days before. The unease didn't come from the romantic content of those images. It came from the repetition. Everything seemed to follow the same emotional blueprint, as if the mansion had learned a pattern and refused to let it go. The narrator began to understand that the place didn't just remember. It taught how to love, where to love, when to love. and it punished, quietly, any attempt at variation. By morning, the narrator found the house excessively tidy. Objects that had been left out of place were perfectly aligned. The main living room table was too clean, almost clinical. It was as if the mansion were trying to regain control, to reorganize the space after the intrusion of that knowledge. The other moved with extra care, avoiding certain looks, avoiding certain corridors. There was love there still was, but now it came with something new, fear of repetition. The narrator felt it in restrained gestures, in the way the other always seemed to measure their own closeness, as if afraid of triggering something simply by being too near. The final confirmation of the bond came in an unexpectedly simple way, late in the afternoon, while the narrator sorted through old papers found in a forgotten library drawer. They came across an old record nearly erased by time, a thin notebook with a cracked leather cover, hidden beneath other books. When the narrator opened it, they realized it wasn't an ordinary diary, but a list, names, only a few names per page. Some crossed out, others marked with tiny symbols, almost imperceptible, vague dates, often incomplete, but something repeated with unsettling regularity, the same last name appearing across different decades, paired with different first names. And on every page, near those names, there was a recurring note, always written in the same old hand, bound. A slow cold ran through the narrator's body. The list wasn't of victims, it was of ties, people who over time had been recognized by the mansion as anchor points, people who belonged to the place in a way that surpassed ordinary logic. The other was on that list, more than once, not with the same name but with variations too clear to be coincidence, as if time had tried to disguise the repetition, and failed. The mansion didn't choose at random, it recognized. The narrator closed the notebook with excessive care, feeling that the object shouldn't be handled carelessly. The confirmation was there, cold and final. Kissing someone bound to the mansion wasn't just an intimate act, it was knowingly stepping into an old cycle, refined, patient, practiced. And most disturbing of all was the clear sense that the house still hadn't shown everything. That was only the end of Act 1, a final warning before the real demand. As the sun set behind the tall trees and the mansion sank again into the dusk it seemed to prefer, the narrator was certain something was being prepared. The house had recognized the new emotional occupant, and now it wanted to know whether he would be just another name, or whether he had the courage to break the pattern. The beginning of Act 2 carried a different sensation than before. It was no longer discovery, it was living with danger. The narrator felt it in the first days after the old bond was confirmed. The mansion no longer needed to hint, it watched openly now, like someone who stops pretending indifference when they realize the other person already knows too much to retreat. Paradoxically, love deepened, not out of innocence, but out of reaction. Faced with an invisible threat, the narrator and the other drew closer with greater intensity, as if every tender gesture were also a gesture of resistance. There was something almost desperate in that closeness, not a loud desperation, but one that shows itself in the way you hold someone's hand too long, in the way you try to memorize the exact weight of an embrace. The mansion seemed to react immediately. Whenever love became more explicit, the atmosphere grew denser, the air turned heavy in the corridors, the floral perfume returned with renewed insistence, no longer as a memory, but as a jealous presence. There was no direct aggression, but there was clear disapproval. The house seemed to dislike being excluded from the bond. The narrator began to notice something even more unsettling. The mansion seemed to try to insert itself emotionally. There were moments when the comfort offered by the space rivaled human comfort, chairs that felt more welcoming than they should, rooms that induced excessive withdrawal, a constant sense that staying was easier than leaving. That was the house's cruelest mechanism. It didn't trap through fear, but through softness. It offered emotional shelter at the exact moment the outside world felt too far away. The other showed clear signs of inner conflict. Some days they seemed more present, more alive, as if the current love were weakening the mansion's old hold. Other days they grew distant, almost automatic, like someone performing gestures out of habit, not conscious choice. The narrator could feel that. The oscillation wasn't ordinary indecision. It was a struggle. Objects began to move more frequently, not in spectacular ways, but in ways that were disturbing in their precision. A book left open to the same page every time. A chair pulled a few inches from its exact place. A window unlatched without explanation. Always the same one. It was as if the mansion were marking territory, constantly reminding them it was still there. The feeling of being watched stopped being vague. The narrator sensed invisible eyes not only at night, but during the day as well, especially in moments of intimacy. There was no malice, there was comparison, as if every gesture were being measured against similar gestures performed before by other people in other times. The letters returned. They weren't found all at once. They appeared individually, as if the house chose moments of emotional vulnerability to deliver them. Some were hidden between book pages. Others appeared folded inside drawers that had just been opened. All of them written in the same handwriting as the woman in the photograph. The content grew more intense. The letters spoke of replacement with increasing clarity. They spoke of someone always arriving believing they were the first. They spoke of the constant fear of losing space inside the house. There were passages that described feelings identical to what the narrator was beginning to experience, as if the writing were being emotionally updated, crossing time. It produced a specific kind of anguish, the fear of not being unique, not even in one's own suffering. The narrator felt their emotions being anticipated, predicted, fitted into an old mold. The mansion didn't seem curious about what would happen. It seemed confident. The psychological tension sharpened when the narrator realized something even more alarming. At times, thoughts of staying appeared effortlessly, not as a rational decision, but as a soft impulse. Ideas of adapting, of accepting, of maybe it wouldn't be so bad to remain. Those thoughts were followed by immediate guilt, as if the mind itself were being gently nudged. The mansion didn't dominate, it suggested. The narrator began to question their own autonomy. To what extent were their feelings truly theirs? To what extent were they echoes? To what extent was the love lived there spontaneous? And to what extent was it the consequence of an environment that knew exactly how to stimulate attachment? Act 2 advanced with that constant tension, almost unbearable in its subtlety. The romance grew deeper, but also more dangerous. Every step toward the other felt like a step toward the house, and the narrator sensed with increasing clarity that, at some point, they would be forced to choose, not only between staying or leaving, but between repeating or breaking. And the mansion, silent and patient, seemed more than ready to collect that choice. The first twist of Act 2 didn't arrive as a complete revelation, but as a misalignment in the world. One of those moments when something small shifts, and because of that shift, everything that seemed stable begins to show its cracks. The narrator noticed it one morning when the mansion was too silent, as if it had removed even the faintest noises from the air to concentrate attention on a single gesture. In the library, the back bookshelf, the oldest, tallest one, where books seemed forgotten for decades, was slightly out of place. It wasn't a big difference, maybe an inch. But the narrator had already learned that in that house, small differences were language. The narrator approached and placed a hand on the dark wood. The sensation was strange. It wasn't only texture, it was resistance, as if the shelf had been moved recently and hadn't settled back into place. When the narrator pushed gently, it yielded with unusual ease, revealing behind it a portion of wall that looked cleaner than it should have. And there, in a narrow cutout, was a slit, not a crack, an opening made with intention. Inside the opening was a book. The narrator pulled it out with a mix of caution and inevitability. It was large, heavy, bound in dark leather. No title, no publisher's mark. The cover held only a symbol pressed in low relief, curved lines forming something like a stylized flower, the same design the narrator had already seen in small details around the house, in discreet carvings, in old marks on the banister, and especially in the notebook of bound names. The book felt too warm for something hidden inside a wall. When the narrator opened it, they realized it wasn't a normal literary work. It was a record, an emotional archive, written by different hands over decades. Each section began with an incomplete date, sometimes only the year, sometimes only the month, and then came the account of someone who had lived in the mansion. The same structure repeated with small variations: arrival, unease, romance, discovery, doubt, fear, choice. A slow tightness seized the narrator's chest as they realized they were reading the story of themselves, not literally, but in pattern, in outline. Some entries were short, cut off abruptly, as if the writer hadn't had time or the courage to continue. Others ran long, full of sensory details so close to what the narrator was living that it became hard to breathe while reading. There were mentions of the floral perfume, the sensation of being watched, the preserved room, the woman in the portrait. And there was a line repeated in different handwriting, as if everyone, at some point, reached the same conclusion. "The house doesn't want you to leave whole." The sentence stayed with the narrator like a verdict. The other appeared in the library with a silent presence. Seeing the open book, they stopped. The expression wasn't surprise, it was defeat, like someone who knows the cycle has advanced to its next stage, and now the house has stopped playing. The narrator kept reading despite the wait. In one of the oldest sections, written in the original woman's firm hand, there was something different, a kind of confession that felt like the center of everything. She described the moment she decided to stay not as romance, but as desperation. She described the pain of impending loss, the fear of being forgotten, and a strange sense that the mansion hurt her. She described the house as something that responded to emotion, like a body that needed to be fed by bonds. And then came the line that changed everything. I made a promise to the house, and the house made a promise to me. The narrator understood, with uncomfortable clarity, that it wasn't legend, it was a pact. Not necessarily supernatural in the traditional sense, but emotional, so intense it became structural. The woman had given her staying to the place, and the place had learned from her how to hold. The twist solidified when the narrator found, near the end of the record, entries far more recent than there should have been. Entries from the last few years, and in them were descriptions of the other in precise detail. The same tired gaze, the same quiet closeness, the same role as a bridge between past and present. A cold opened in the narrator's stomach as they realized the other wasn't just someone who ended up in the mansion. They were part of the mechanism, not by conscious choice, but by emotional design. The house needed someone to be an anchor, someone continuously bound to it, drawing new people in, renewing the cycle. And then came the final detail, the one that made the narrator shut the book with trembling hands. In multiple entries, different people mentioned the same kiss, in the same spot in the house, as if it were a trigger, as if the kiss were the key that fits and turns. The narrator realized the kiss they'd given wasn't just love, it was activation. The mansion now wasn't merely remembering anymore, it was executing, and Act 2 moved forward, into a territory where secrets wouldn't be discovered by accident. They would be presented on purpose, like pieces of a game decided a long time ago. After discovering the book, the narrator felt that something fundamental had changed. Not in the mansion, everything there still seemed to obey the same patient pattern, but inside themselves. Knowledge has that corrosive effect. It doesn't shout, it doesn't shove, it doesn't force. It simply takes up space until there's no room left for denial. Love, which had until then served as shelter against the place's strangeness, began to hurt, not because it diminished, but because it grew in the wrong direction. It became a love weighted with layers that didn't belong to the present. Every gesture of affection came with the awareness that the same gesture had already been repeated, watched, recorded, compared. The mansion didn't forget kisses, it archived them. The narrator began to feel a suspicion they had avoided until then, doubt about the authenticity of their own emotions. Not that they were false, but that they were influenced. How much of the attachment was spontaneous? How much was an echo of feelings preserved in the space? The house seemed to know exactly which sensations to stimulate in order to deepen the bond, like someone who learns the rhythm of a heart and then controls it with cruel precision. The other's presence grew more complicated. There was real love there. The narrator no longer doubted that. But there was also something that edged dangerously close to function. At times, the other seemed to act as an involuntary mediator between the house and the narrator, as if constantly balancing two opposing forces, protecting the newcomer and obeying the mansion's old logic. Sometimes the other seemed to wake up from that role. There were flashes of clarity, quiet rebellion, moments when their closeness felt almost like a plea for help. Other times, they seemed to sink back into a strange automatism, as if the body remembered a path the mind tried to deny. That back and forth created a constant anguish in the narrator, an unfamiliar fear, the fear of loving someone who isn't entirely free. The mansion intensified its manifestations. At night, the narrator began hearing more defined sounds, not just creaks, but clear movement, light footsteps traveling from one room to another, always the same route, always the same hour. The floral perfume rose stronger in those moments, almost like a warning someone is awake. Objects also began to appear displaced in ways too symbolic to ignore. One morning, the locket from the preserved room showed up on the main living room table, open, as if it had been removed to be remembered. Another time, the embroidered handkerchief appeared folded on the narrator's bed, carefully placed on the pillow, like an intimacy that went too far. None of it sparked immediate panic. It sparked emotional invasion, the sense that private space was being shared without consent. The woman from the past didn't present as a physical threat, but as a jealous presence, judging, comparing, coming too close. The narrator began to feel something even more disturbing. Fragments of memory that didn't belong to their life surfaced spontaneously. Sensations of old parties, muffled laughter, hands touching the same wood, the same banister, the same window. Not clear visions, but complete emotional states, as if the narrator were accessing memories archived in the environment. It began to erode the narrator's sense of identity. In silence, they wondered who they would be outside that house, who they would be away from that love, who they would be without that constant pressure to repeat. The mansion seemed to narrow the options, making the outside world feel distant, almost irrelevant. The psychological tension climbed to a new level when the narrator realized thoughts of staying were arriving with increasing ease. Ideas like maybe it's easier to remain or maybe this is destiny appeared effortlessly, followed by an immediate sense of comfort. That comfort was the most dangerous sign, because it didn't come from the other, it came from the house. The book, returned to the slit behind the bookshelf, seemed to remain active even when closed. The narrator felt its presence like constant weight, as if the mansion were waiting for the moment it would be reopened so the next chapter could be written with a different handwriting, but the same emotional content. Act 2 was now moving toward a critical point. Love was no longer just romance. It was a battlefield. Every gesture of affection carried risk. Every attempt at distance triggered an immediate reaction from the environment. The mansion began demanding something clearer than simple attention. And on a night when the house's inner wind traveled through every corridor like one long sigh, the narrator felt a certainty settle in. The house wasn't just watching the relationship, it was waiting for someone to accept the center. The turning point of Act 2 began to form the day the narrator realized the mansion was no longer reacting only to events, it was anticipating them. The feeling was strange, as if the place knew the next thought, the next doubt, the next impulse to flee, and before those impulses could become action, the house had already offered a response. That afternoon, the narrator decided to leave, not out of a desire to abandon the other, and not from sudden courage, but from a physical need to breathe far from walls that seemed to listen. The narrator walked through the small town, crossing nearly empty streets, feeling the outside air like something rare. The sky was overcast, but there was a lightness outside that felt impossible inside the mansion. Even so, a shadow followed, not literal, emotional. The narrator felt that no matter how far they walked, the mansion remained present as an inescapable thought. So did the love. And the mixture of those two things created a kind of vertigo. Loving and fleeing felt like incompatible movements. When the narrator returned at dusk, they found the mansion gate slightly open, not thrown wide, just open enough to suggest someone had passed through. A slow shiver ran down the narrator's spine, not from fear of a human intruder, but from recognizing the house's language. It didn't need to lock or unlock. It simply altered reality with small gestures that said, "I know." Inside, the entry hall was lit by candles. There was no scent of freshly melted wax. The flames were already established, as if they'd been prepared ahead of time. The flickering light pulled the mansion into another era, casting shadows deeper than they should have been. The air held the floral perfume with an intensity the narrator had never felt before, nearly suffocating. The narrator felt the house wasn't merely setting a mood, it was summoning. The path to the main parlor felt longer than usual. The narrator walked, but it felt like passing through layers of history. The silence wasn't the absence of sound, it was concentrated presence. Somewhere in the distance, the old clock struck irregular hours, short and long beats alternating, as if trying to reproduce a rhythm someone had heard before. The main parlor had been transformed. The portraits on the walls seemed to have been turned slightly toward the center of the room, as if invisible witnesses had been positioned. On the floor, the dark circle of dust was complete, more defined than ever, outlining a symbolic space that seemed to pulse with meaning. The narrator didn't need words to understand. That was the room of choice. The other was there, standing outside the circle, motionless, their face carrying a deep exhaustion. It wasn't indifference, it was wear. It was the expression of someone who had lived that moment in other forms, with other people, and failed to stop the house from reaching the same point again. The mansion did not present direct physical threat. It didn't knock things down, didn't slam doors shut, didn't scream through noise. It offered, and that offer was more dangerous than any aggression. The narrator felt the original woman's presence more strongly than ever before, not as shadow, not as perfume alone, but as full emotion moving through the body with ancient weight. It felt like being watched by someone who loved too much, suffered too much, refused to be forgotten. The presence wasn't hatred, it was vigilance, it was claim. The mansion revealed its proposal without words, brutally clear. Uninvited images poured into the narrator's mind. Life inside the mansion, permanent. A love frozen at its peak, nowhere, no change, no ending. The house offered a kind of emotional eternity, not an eternity of days, but of intensity. A love always urgent, always alive, always afraid to lose, and precisely for that reason always feeding the mansion. In return, it demanded the price it had always demanded: occupation. Someone to be the center, someone to be the constant presence, replacing the original woman or joining her. Someone to remain not as a free person, but as active memory, bound into the structure of the place. The narrator understood the offer wasn't made with malice, it was made with need. The mansion was an emotional entity built from the human fear of loss. It existed because someone once refused the end, and now it reproduced that refusal endlessly. The turning point locked into place when the narrator realized that accepting wouldn't mean simply staying with the other. It would mean staying with the mansion, becoming part of it, becoming a new living archive. The house seemed to wait for a simple gesture. Step into the circle. The narrator felt temptation like something physical. The promise of never losing was powerful. The promise of a love that wouldn't fade, wouldn't age, wouldn't become distant memory. The fear of being forgotten, replaced, of being just another name on a list, throbbed like an animal inside the chest. And at the same time, there was a clear intuition that accepting would be a kind of death, not of the body, of autonomy, a soft, comfortable, seductive death. Act 2 ended on that threshold, the narrator facing the circle, feeling the house breathe with expectation, feeling love tremble between freedom and captivity, and realizing that the decision approaching would change not only the present, but the nature of a past still insisting on living. Act 3 began the way irreversible things begin, with a calm that feels unfair. After the circle in the parlor, after the silent offer, the mansion didn't rush. There was no immediate punishment for hesitation, no explosion of events. Only a strategic retreat, as if the house understood that when a decision is too large, fear needs time to ripen into choice. The narrator moved through the following hours as if in suspension. The body moved, but the mind stayed anchored at the edge of the circle, measuring invisible consequences. The mansion felt lighter, almost kind, as if it wanted to prove it could be comfortable if it were given what it wanted. That was the true danger, the gentleness with which a prison disguises itself as shelter. The others stayed close, but quiet. Their closeness was no longer simple romance, it was emotional responsibility. The narrator felt that loving them meant deciding for them too, because the other was too tightly bound to the cycle. There was a deep fatigue in their gestures, an old melancholy that couldn't be explained by the present alone, the mark of someone who has tried again and again to escape a structure that feeds precisely on the fear of escaping. The narrator began to watch the mansion with new eyes. Before they had looked for signs of haunting, now they looked for mechanism. What sustains a place like this? What turns a promise into architecture? What turns a kiss into a repeatable trigger? The answer always seemed to point downward, not to the upper floor where the noises happened, but to the bottom of the house, to the oldest spaces, the parts that felt like they existed before the mansion was even a mansion. In that state of restless focus, the narrator noticed something in the entry hall, a low, almost discreet door that opened onto a service stairwell. It had always been there, but it had always seemed irrelevant, as if the eyes dismissed it out of habit. Now, however, it looked more visible, as if the light had subtly highlighted it. The narrator felt with clarity that this was the direction, not because anyone said so, but because the body recognized it. When the narrator opened the door, they found a narrow staircase descending to a lower level. The air down there was colder, but it wasn't ordinary cold. It was old cold, saturated with history. The scent of wood gave way to damp stone and iron, as if the space kept the echo of something rusted. The narrator descended slowly. Each step felt more uneven than the last. Footfalls sounded muffled, as if the staircase had been built to absorb noise. It felt like crossing not only a physical space, but an emotional core. The entire mansion seemed to retreat with every step, as if above existed the present, and below existed the point where the past had become permanent. At the bottom was a circular room, not the library, but another one, rawer, older. The walls were bare stone marked with damp. The ceiling was low, and the air felt as if it hadn't moved in decades. In the center, a circle was carved into the floor, not drawn in dust, but etched into the stone itself. A circle made to last. In that moment, the narrator knew they were standing in the mansion's true heart, the place where the promise had been made, where fear turned into structure. The original woman's presence intensified, not as a threat, but as human weight. The narrator felt her youth, her desperation, her decision, felt the way she loved someone already bound to the house, and, when she sensed loss approaching, decided she would not survive an ending. She did what many people do inwardly, but few do with such intensity that the world responds. She demanded permanence. The truth began to reveal itself as a total sensation. The mansion wasn't a supernatural being in the ordinary sense. It was an emotional entity born from repetition. A place that learned, through that woman, that love can be used as glue. The place learned that if it offered the promise of never losing, there would always be someone willing to accept the trade. The great secret wasn't only the pact, but the mechanism. The mansion didn't steal people. It persuaded them to stay. It seduced them with the idea that pain can be avoided if life is suspended before the end. And to keep that system running, it needed two things: someone bound to the place, a living anchor, and someone new, a fresh heart, capable of falling in love and therefore capable of fearing loss. The narrator realized with an inward jolt the other was the anchor, and the narrator was the fresh heart. The mansion needed the kiss to seal that fit. It needed to activate the cycle through something so intimate that, afterward, retreat would feel impossible without breaking something precious. That was the house's perfect strike, turning love into a trap without ever resembling violence. The narrator stood in the center of the circle carved into the stone floor. not in submission but in confrontation. And there, in the deepest point of the house, the narrator felt the greatest fear rise with full clarity, accepting that loving includes losing, and that trying to avoid loss is simply another way of dying. Act 3 moved toward the climax with that truth burning in the chest. The narrator didn't need to fight a ghost. They needed to fight the temptation to deny the end. At the center of the underground room, the narrator felt something unlike anything they'd experienced before. It was no longer the vague sensation of being watched, nor the abstract weight of an old presence. It was closeness, an intimacy so complete it seemed to pass through skin and lodge directly in the breath. The mansion had led the narrator there not to frighten them, but to present itself. The original woman's presence organized not as a shape, but as awareness. There was no body, no visible face in physical space. There was condensed emotion, there was intention, there was an entire story compressed into sensation. The narrator understood that the woman no longer existed as a person, but she also wasn't dead the way an ordinary memory is dead. She was emotional permanence. What remains when someone refuses to accept the end? The narrator felt her love with an intensity that was almost unbearable. Not a sweet love, but an anxious one, built on fear. A love that could not tolerate the idea of being remembered only as the past. The woman had loved someone bound to the mansion, perhaps the first, perhaps only the most unforgettable. And when she realized time would take everything, she chose to make the house a continuation of herself. She didn't want eternity out of vanity. She wanted it out of terror. The narrator understood with a painful empathy, because that fear was too human, the fear that everything intense disappears. The fear that love becomes just a story told by others. The fear of being replaced, forgotten, dissolved in the passage of years. The woman didn't hate those who came after. She watched, compared, measured, not out of cruelty but out of emotional vigilance. Every new love that formed in the mansion threatened her symbolic permanence. And at the same time, it confirmed her method worked. The house kept calling, kept holding, kept repeating. The narrator realized the woman's suffering wasn't active, but continuous. She didn't scream. She didn't attack. She waited, waiting for someone to accept the place, waiting for someone to say I stay with the same desperate intensity she had spoken decades earlier. The mansion, built on that feeling, had learned to reproduce it. Every wall, every corridor, every silent ritual was an extension of that first fear. The house wasn't evil. It was too faithful to an old pain. And the narrator felt the story's greatest emotional conflict form with absolute clarity. Understanding the mansion's origin did not reduce its power. It made the choice harder, because now it wasn't a matter of confronting something monstrous, but deciding whether they had the courage to hurt an old wound to keep it from spreading. The original woman offered her truth without words. The narrator felt the moment she chose to stay, felt the promise made to the house, felt the instant fear defeated acceptance, and felt too the late regret, not for having loved, but for turning love into a prison. The narrator understood, with a clarity that hurt, that the woman didn't need a replacement. She needed closure. She needed someone finally to accept the end for her. She needed someone to do what she could not do while she still had a body and time. Let go. The mansion reacted to the approach of that understanding with rising tension. The stone walls of the underground room vibrated faintly, not as threat, but as resistance. The place didn't know how to exist without the promise. Ending the cycle meant dismantling the house's very identity. The narrator felt the weight of the final decision draw near. It wouldn't be enough to refuse, to step into the circle. It wouldn't be enough to leave. The cycle would break only if someone offered the mansion what it had never received, a conscious goodbye, and that would require a radical gesture. The narrator felt a cold object in their hand, something left there long ago, waiting for exactly this moment. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't an instrument of domination. It was a symbol of ending, something that could turn permanence into ordinary memory. The original woman seemed to watch with quiet attention, not with demand, but with contained hope. For the first time in emotional decades, real rest was possible. The narrator's heart slammed, and they realized their greatest fear wasn't dying, nor being trapped. Their greatest fear was accepting that true love doesn't need to last forever in order to have been real. The climax approached, and the next gesture would decide whether the mansion would keep calling or finally learn how to let go. The narrator remained in the center of the underground room for a length of time that was hard to measure. Down there, time had a different density. Seconds stretched as if the air were heavier, and every breath felt like passing through layers of memory deposited in the space. The mansion above seemed distant, yet present, as if the rest of the house were only an extension of that core where the promise had hardened. The final gesture did not arrive as simple courage. It arrived as loss, because to say goodbye to a structure built on fear of loss, you had to accept losing something for real. And the narrator knew the mansion didn't demand material payment. It demanded emotional payment. The cold object in the narrator's hand, that symbol of closure, seemed to pulse with meaning. It wasn't a traditional tool, not a key, not a letter. It was a small fragment of old metal, part of a clasp, marked with the same symbol that appeared in the book and in the house's carvings. A fragment the narrator understood as a kind of seal. What seals a promise can also seal its end. The original woman's presence intensified, and the narrator sensed something in her that hadn't been so clear before. Fatigue, not from physical years, but from repetition. An existence made of watching, comparing, fearing. An existence reduced to ensuring love would not be forgotten, and in the process preventing it from resting. Then the narrator saw the most painful truth. The mansion wasn't full of hauntings. It was full of interrupted endings. Endings trapped in the form of expectation. The house was an emotional organism that survived because it never received complete closure. Every person who arrived and fell in love renewed the original promise. Every repeated kiss reignited the invisible pact. Every attempt to leave without a full goodbye left residue that reinforced the structure. Breaking the cycle meant offering what no one had offered, a total ending. The narrator closed their eyes for a moment and let love be felt without defense. Not only love for the other, but love for the very idea of permanence, love for the human dream of not losing. The narrator allowed themselves to feel the fear that fed it all, the fear that love becomes only memory, the fear that people replace one another, the fear that time erases. And then, slowly, the narrator chose to accept that love is real even when it ends. Chose to accept that memory doesn't have to be a prison to be an honor. Chose to accept that I stay can be the cruelest sentence when spoken out of desperation, and the most human sentence when transformed into I remember. The gesture happened in silence. The narrator placed the metal fragment in the center of the circle carved into the stone and pressed down hard, as if returning to the ground what had been used for decades to hold the past in place. The pressure didn't open a physical passage. It opened something emotional. The narrator felt an invisible tension give way, like a cord stretched for years finally snapping. The mansion reacted immediately, not with screams, not with violence, but with release. An inner wind surged through the underground room, rising up the stairwell like a deep exhale. The floral perfume bloomed intensely, flooding the air with almost total presence, as if the original woman were being felt fully for the last time. And then it began to fade, not all at once, but the way something dissolves with dignity. The narrator felt memories that weren't theirs move through the body, not as clear scenes, but as whole emotions, passion, jealousy, hope, grief, promises made in the dark, hands gripping banisters, tears falling onto letters, muffled laughter at old parties. It all passed like a current and then let go. The original woman drew as close as emotion could reach, not to demand replacement, to accept. The narrator felt a quiet gratitude mixed with relief and mourning. She wasn't being erased. She was being returned to the right place. The past, the mansion, its emotional structure began to change. The carved circle seemed to lose its symbolic density. The stone walls, once saturated with presence, became only stone. The air, once heavy with expectation, became only damp, cold air. The narrator climbed the stairs feeling a lightness that hurt. Lightness because the old weight had been released. Pain because freeing something also means letting something die, even when it never should have lived that long. Upstairs, the main parlor was dark. The candles had gone out. The old clock kept time with ordinary regularity. The portraits on the walls were just portraits. The silence no longer watched. It simply existed. The climax completed itself in that simple instant. The mansion didn't react anymore. It didn't demand anymore. It didn't whisper anymore. It had finally received the goodbye. It never had. What followed wasn't immediate joy. It was a new silence, and new silence is always strange. The narrator noticed it in the first minutes after coming up from the basement. The mansion seemed less aware. The house still creaked, still cracked, still carried the smell of old wood and damp. But there was no intention in those sounds anymore. They didn't feel like responses. They felt like aged matter doing what aged matter does. The difference was subtle but absolute. The narrator walked the corridors like someone walking inside a memory that had just become stable. Before, every step felt watched by something that compared. Now, the narrator felt only their own weight and the floor's natural echo. The shadows no longer seemed loaded. They were just shadows, children of weak light and heavy curtains. The air held no floral perfume at all. That absence was the first truly undeniable sign that something had been closed. There was, however, grief. A grief that didn't come from losing someone visible, but from removing an architecture of intensity from the world. The mansion, with its invisible threat, had made everything more urgent. Love under danger felt more alive. Without the danger, love would have to prove itself on different ground, the human ground of ordinary days. The narrator found the other in a part of the house that always carried tension, near the main staircase. The other stood still, like someone waiting to feel a pull, and when they didn't know what to do with the freedom. Their expression held deep bewilderment. Not fear, not immediate relief. just an initial emptiness, as if a cord had been cut after years of constant strain. The narrator realized, with a soft pain, that this person had been shaped by decades of emotional repetition. Part of them had learned to be necessary to the mansion, and now, without that necessity, there was an inner space to fill, not with another prison, but with real identity. The love between them moved through that moment like a slow river. There was no romantic explosion, no victory. There was a quiet recognition that everything would be harder now because it would be real. Loving outside the cycle would require ordinary choices, small decisions, time shared without drama engineered by fate. The narrator realized that, in a way, the mansion had been a third presence in the relationship. It created tension, created urgency, created the feeling of inevitability. Without that presence, what remained were two people with their fragilities and their limits. That was more fragile, but also more true. In the days that followed, the change in the atmosphere became even more evident. Doors that once seemed to close with intention now stayed exactly where they were left. The old clock marked the hours in an ordinary way, without strange variations. Objects stopped appearing in impossible places. The preserved bedroom, when visited again, seemed to have lost the emotional density that once made the air feel occupied. It was still an old room, still carefully kept, but now it was preserved the way a museum is preserved, not the way a person is preserved. The narrator went into that room one last time and held the locket. There was no wave of foreign emotion, no jealousy rising from nowhere. There was only simple, human sadness, for the story of someone who loved too much and feared too much, for the way fear can turn a feeling into a trap. The narrator understood the original woman hadn't been defeated. She had been freed. And freeing isn't erasing. It's allowing something to exist in the past without demanding that it keep haunting the present. Outside, the small town stayed the same, indifferent, faithful to its habit of silence. That gave the narrator an almost bitter realization. Some cycles are broken without the world noticing. Some battles are fought inside old houses and inside tired hearts, while the rest of life goes on buying bread, sweeping sidewalks, talking about the weather as if weather were only climate. The narrator and the other began to prepare to leave, not as an escape, but as a healthier continuation. To remain in the mansion, now asleep, would still be to remain in a place built on repetition. And the narrator had learned that breaking a cycle doesn't mean breaking it once. It means refusing to feed it again. On the final night, the mansion seemed to accept the farewell. There was no inner wind, no sequence of creaks, no perfume rising to beg for permanence. Only the ordinary silence of an old house before dawn. The narrator walked through the entry hall and touched the banister of the main staircase. The wood was cold, but it was a physical cold, not an emotional one. The narrator realized that was freedom, being able to touch things without feeling them touch back. Before leaving, the narrator looked one last time at the portraits in the hallway. The original woman's face was only a face now. There was still something intense in her eyes, but it was an intensity frozen in paint and paper, not in presence. It was memory, not vigilance. When the front door closed, the sound it made was ordinary. Wood meeting wood. An old latch sliding into place, nothing more. And as the car drove away down the dirt road, the tall trees forming that natural corridor, the narrator felt the final echo of the story not as haunting, but as teaching. Love is not holding on. Love is allowing something to exist with dignity, even if it ends, because the end does not disprove love. The end only returns love to the place it always should have lived, in memory, not in a prison. The narrator carried with them a gentle certainty, difficult, but liberating. Destiny only feels inevitable until someone finds the courage to say goodbye. And for the first time, the idea of the future didn't feel like a threat. It felt like space. The silence that came after the mansion was neither immediate nor complete. It arrived in layers, like anything too deep to resolve all at once. In the first days after leaving, the narrator noticed their bodies still reacted as if it were being watched. There was an involuntary expectation in every corridor of any new place, a conditioned reflex of attention, as if something might manifest at any moment. It wasn't fear, it was habit. The mansion had taught the narrator to live in a constant state of emotional alert, even far away, even in ordinary spaces, even in environments full of people and light. There were moments when the narrator felt the impulse to measure their steps, to avoid certain corners, to listen to silence as if it might answer. Freedom, when it arrives after long vigilance, doesn't show up as immediate relief. It confuses first. Those early months were marked by that strangeness. The narrator and the others settled in a simple place. No history, no imposing architecture, no corridors that went on too long. An ordinary, functional, almost impersonal space. And still the narrator missed something. Not the mansion itself, but the intensity it forced. That was the first real grief. Grief for the loss of artificial intensity. Because the mansion had taught that love must be urgent to be true. That constant risk is proof of depth. That fear of losing keeps the bond alive. Outside it, Love grew too quiet, too spaced out, too human, and that, paradoxically, was frightening. There were nights when the narrator woke expecting creaks, expecting perfume in the air, expecting that precise moment when the environment became aware. When it didn't happen, an uncomfortable emptiness appeared, not because something bad was missing, but because something intense was gone. The narrator began to understand that breaking a cycle doesn't erase its side effects. The body still carries the memory of the prison, even after the doors are open. And sometimes you have to relearn how to trust silence. The other carried deep marks as well. There was a visible emotional displacement in them. For a long time, their identity had been tied to the invisible function of anchor. Even without full awareness, they had learned to exist as a point of return, someone who always stayed, someone who sustained the house's continuity. Outside that role, a hard question surfaced. Who am I when no one needs me to remain? The question wasn't spoken, but it showed up in gestures, in small hesitations, in sudden moments of withdrawal, in a discreet melancholy that arrived without warning, like a brief shadow crossing the day. The narrator saw that loving now demanded something new, patience without drama, care without ritual, presence without urgency. There was guilt, too, guilt for having had to destroy something, even if that something was an emotional prison, in order to move forward. Guilt for imagining the original woman no longer as presence, but as a closed memory. Guilt for knowing that without that final gesture, the cycle would have continued calling others, with other names, in other eras. The narrator realized the guilt didn't come from doing something wrong, it came from doing something final. Ending old stories requires an emotional maturity that is rarely comfortable. There is no celebration in a conscious ending. There is only acceptance. As the weeks passed, the dreams began to change. Early on, the mansion still appeared often, not as a threat, but as a setting. Empty corridors, shut windows, the garden growing wild. The house showed up silent, motionless, like a body in deep rest. The narrator understood those dreams not as relapse, but as the brain reorganizing memories that had been too intense. Slowly, the mansion appeared less. And when it did appear, it was distant, blurred, without scent, without sound. That mattered. The house was becoming what it always should have been, a memory. The narrator began to notice subtle shifts in how they loved. Before, there had been a constant need for confirmation, intensity, proof. Now something else emerged, a love that didn't need surveillance to exist. A love that didn't feed on fear of loss, but on the daily choice to stay. That didn't make everything easy. It made everything real. There were days that were too ordinary, silences that held no mystery. Small human conflicts that didn't resolve through symbolism, but through effort. And slowly, that began to teach the narrator what the mansion would never allow them to learn. Healthy love doesn't take up all the space. It lives alongside the world, still, in very specific moments. Usually when the day ended in absolute quiet, the narrator felt a distant echo. Not a calling, not a temptation, but a soft, almost respectful reminder. As if something old recognized it no longer had the right to demand presence, but still existed as part of the story. And the narrator accepted that without guilt. Because some houses don't need to be forgotten. They only need to stop calling. Over the months, the narrator started to realize the mind accepts the end long before the body does. Reason understood the liberation, recognized the necessity of the final gesture, validated the choice made in the underground room. But the body, this quiet archive of deep experiences, kept reacting as if it were still inside the mansion. Body memory is always slower. It doesn't respond to explanations. It responds to repetition. There were unexpected moments when the narrator felt a shiver, walking down corridors that were too long in ordinary buildings, as if excessive length could waken involuntary memory. Sometimes the smell of old wood in a historic building tightened the chest, not in fear, but recognition. And above all, deep silence sometimes triggered an old expectation of response. In those moments, the narrator had to remind themselves consciously, nothing is waiting. That reminder wasn't negative. It was practice, like someone who listened to a constant noise for years and, once it's gone, has to teach the body that silence doesn't mean danger. The mansion had taught the narrator to confuse attention with love. Now they had to learn the opposite. Love can exist, even when it doesn't occupy every sense. The other went through something similar, but differently. While the narrator wrestled with sensory echoes, the other faced a deeper rebuilding of identity. For a long time, they had been the bound one, the fixed point, the constant return. Without the mansion, that role evaporated, leaving an inner space hard to name. The narrator saw it in the other's hesitation around simple choices. Small decisions, where to go, how to fill time, what to want, seemed to require too much effort, not from incapacity, but because before, those decisions were quietly guided by an external force. Now, everything had to be chosen from scratch. It created subtle but important conflict, not dramatic fights, human friction. The narrator began to understand that loving someone who has stepped out of an emotional prison takes a particular patience. It isn't about saving them, it's about walking beside them as they relearn how to move without invisible chains. There were moments when the narrator missed the old version of love, the kind intensified by danger, by destiny, by the mansion's emotional architecture. Nights when everything felt too simple, almost shallow. In those hours, a quiet temptation would surface, romanticize the past, turn the prison into poetry, forget the price it demanded. But remembering the constant weight, the invisible vigilance, the fear of being replaced was enough to drain the temptation of its strength. The narrator began to understand, with growing maturity, that intensity is not proof of truth. Often, it's proof of an open wound. Over time, the dream shifted again. The mansion stopped appearing altogether. When it did show up, it was only as a distant facade, nearly irrelevant. In its place, the dreams brought open spaces, long roads, ordinary houses with no mystery. The brain at last seemed to accept that the cycle was finished. The narrator began to write, not directly about the mansion, but about the human experience of confusing permanence with love. The writing wasn't confession or exorcism, it was organization. Putting words to the experience helped restore boundaries to what had once been too much. The mansion, once a whole universe, became a chapter. The narrator's relationship with time changed too. Before, everything felt urgent. Every gesture had to mean something. Every moment carried symbolic weight. Now something new and disorienting arrived. The right to be ordinary, the right to days without deeper meaning, the right to affection that doesn't demand constant proof. At first, that ordinariness felt like a threat. Then it became relief. The narrator learned that love that survives outside the cycle is love that allows itself to be forgotten for moments, allows itself not to be the center of the universe every second, allows space for work, exhaustion, distraction, neutral silence. And that doesn't make it smaller, it makes it human. Months later, there was a specific moment when the narrator realized something had finally shifted inside. Passing an old, imposing house surrounded by trees, the body prepared to react. Then nothing came, no shiver, no expectation, no imagined perfume. The house was just a house. That small moment was a quiet victory, not celebrated, not announced, just felt. The narrator understood then that the mansion had never been only a place. It had been a concentrated lesson, a lesson in how fear of loss can build entire structures, emotional, symbolic, architectural, that convince U.S. prison is protection, understanding that didn't erase the pain, but it stopped it from repeating. Slowly, the body was learning what the mind already knew. The cycle had ended, and silence no longer needed to be interrogated. With freedom came a question the narrator had avoided for a long time, not out of fear, but out of respect for their own emotional limits. What exactly had happened to the original woman after the ending? The answer couldn't be confirmed by material proof. There was no certificate for the invisible, no document of the spirit. There were only consequences, and the consequences little by little began to sketch meaning. The original woman didn't vanish from the world as if she had never existed. She remained the way anything, intense remains, in memory and sensation and effect. The difference was that now she no longer needed to act. She no longer needed to watch. She no longer needed to demand. Her presence had stopped being will and had become story. And to the narrator, that was a kind of peace. There came a moment when the narrator realized they thought of her with genuine compassion, not fear. Before, she'd been threat, shadow, invisible rival. Now she was human, someone who loved desperately, who tried to prevent an ending with the emotional tools she had. There was no essential malice in that act. There was fragility, and fragility, when it grows too large, can build prisons. The narrator began to understand the mansion wasn't only an anomaly. It was a concrete metaphor for what many people do inside themselves: build structures so they won't lose, freeze feelings, turn memories into demands. What happened in that house was extreme but recognizable, the architectural version of a deeply human emotional pattern that gave the narrator a quiet responsibility, not the responsibility to save the world, but the responsibility not to reproduce the same logic elsewhere. The mansion had taught, with brutal poetry, that love can't be treated as property, love can't be defended with imprisonment, and the narrator began to watch in themselves for any impulse of control disguised as care. There were weeks when the relationship with the other felt fragile, not from lack of love, but from rebuilding. It was as if both had to relearn how to recognize each other without the mystery as backdrop, without the mansion as a third presence, without the urgency that made every gesture feel decisive. On those days, the narrator saw how easy it is to chase intensity to avoid real emotional labor, because everyday love is demanding in a different way. It doesn't offer the dramatic shine of destiny. It offers small tasks, staying, listening, enduring boredom, crossing fatigue, resisting the temptation to turn ordinary conflict into catastrophe. The narrator understood that if love survived now, it would be because it was choice, not because it was script. And slowly the other began to show signs of a true waking. Small preferences emerged, small desires, small disagreements, simple things that, paradoxically, signaled health. Before, the other had seemed to exist as an extension of a larger story. Now they were beginning to exist as a whole person, with their own limits and wants. That brought beauty and difficulty, because loving someone whole also means accepting difference. The narrator noticed that fear of loss, though it still existed as a human shadow, no longer governed the bond. Before, loss had been the center of everything: possible loss, avoided loss, threatened loss. Now loss was simply the natural possibility of time, and accepting that was, strangely, what made love lighter. Sometimes the narrator remembered the mansion not with longing, but with a kind of distant respect, like respecting the force of a storm that has passed. There was a dark beauty in how that place condensed feeling, but there was an inevitable cruelty in how it demanded repetition. The narrator also began to notice something curious. The mansion no longer called. No more insistent dreams. No more coincidences tugging back. The road to the rusted gate still existed on a map, but it no longer existed as an emotional destination. That was the clearest proof the cycle had truly been broken. When a place loses its power to call, it finally becomes only a place. Still, in very specific moments, the narrator felt a soft echo, not an invitation but a reminder. A reminder that some stories don't disappear completely because they help build who we became. The narrator carried the mansion like a scar, not as constant pain, but as a mark of learning. Life moved on, and the narrator realized the greatest sign of healing was the ability to plan without guilt. Simple plans, moving furniture, choosing routes, making projects. Inside the mansion, every plan felt provisional, as if the future were forbidden. Outside it, the future returned as open possibility. Little by little, the narrator understood what it truly means to end a cycle, not to erase the past, but to return the past to the right place, a place where it can be remembered without dominating, honored without demanding repetition, held as memory, not as chain, and in that understanding, the original woman finally had a dignified fate, to be remembered without being obeyed. Maybe that's the rarest kind of love, the kind that even respects the past's right to rest. Almost a year after leaving, the narrator noticed something they had feared and hoped for at once. The memory of the mansion no longer rose automatically when they thought of love. It came only when invited. That may sound small, but for someone who lived under the weight of a place that called without permission, it was profound. Before, any intense emotion, joy, fear, desire, loss, immediately tugged the invisible thread back to the old house. Now the thread still existed, but it lay loose. No constant tension, no involuntary pull. The mansion had lost its role as emotional center and become only a coordinate in memory. The narrator started noticing changes beyond themselves. Vague news from the small town arrived now and then through distant comments, without drama. The mansion had been listed for sale, then pulled from the listing. Later, word came that no one had shown serious interest, not out of explicit fear, but out of disinterest. The house, once charged with something undefinable, now seemed simply too big, too old, too quiet to spark curiosity. That didn't sadden the narrator. It brought a strange relief to realize the place no longer called anyone. No new stories beginning there, no cycles being prepared. The silence left behind wasn't expectation, it was rest. The narrator imagined the mansion on ordinary days, windows shut for months, dust gathering with no symbolic intent, the garden growing wild not from emotional rebellion but simple neglect, wood creaking only from temperature shifts, no perfume in the air beyond what time naturally produces. The house aging the way all houses age when they stop being a stage for intense human projection. The image brought unexpected peace. For the first time, the narrator could picture the mansion without people. Before, it had seemed to depend on human presence to keep existing. Now it could exist as potential ruin, historical object, matter, not as emotional organism. At one point, the narrator decided to return to the town, not to the mansion, but to the town. Not out of nostalgia, but for symbolic closure. Walking the same streets, seeing the same shops, watching familiar faces age by habit brought a clear realization. The town was never the mansion's accomplice. It was only its neighbor. People learned to ignore the place because ignoring it was the only way not to be dragged into it. With late maturity, the narrator understood the collective silence wasn't cowardice. It was intuition. The town had learned, generation after generation, that some stories aren't resolved by talking about them. They're resolved by refusing to feed them. Passing through the central square brought another quiet confirmation. The bulletin board looked different. The old photograph of the mansion had been removed. Nothing replaced it. The empty space where it had hung looked intentional, as if someone had decided the image no longer needed to be displayed. It didn't feel like erasure. It felt like a public ending, spoken without words. The narrator felt something close to gratitude for those unknown people. They didn't know exactly what had been broken, but they sensed something had changed. Places communicate when they stop demanding. Back in their current life, far from the small town, the narrator found the mansion had become an internal reference point. Whenever the temptation arose to confuse attachment with love, the memory surfaced as a gentle warning. Whenever fear of loss threatened to become control, the image of the carved circle returned as a reminder of the cost. The love lived now, less dramatic, more spaced out, more human, began to reveal a different kind of depth. A depth that doesn't depend on constant intensity but on conscious continuity. The narrator realized true permanence isn't freezing feelings, it's allowing them to change without disappearing. It showed up in small choices, allowing distance without panic, accepting silences without reading them as abandonment, understanding the other doesn't have to be everything for love to be real. The mansion demanded totality, real life demanded balance. One afternoon, almost by accident, the narrator passed a house that resembled the one from the story. Large, surrounded by trees, tall windows, a rusted iron gate. For a brief second, memory activated, but instead of a shiver, there was only observation. The house didn't call, it didn't promise, it didn't ask for anything. It was just architecture. In that moment, the narrator knew the epilogue was deepening not as continuation of pain, but as confirmation of freedom. The mansion now existed only as a silent lesson. What we build to avoid loss will inevitably demand that someone be lost. And the narrator was no longer willing to trade freedom for any promise. With time, the narrator understood that every intense story gets reorganized by memory, not dishonestly, but necessarily. What was once lived as urgency becomes symbol. What once felt like destiny becomes choice. What once hurt begins to teach without cutting. That was how, long afterward, the narrator could revisit the kiss that began the cycle without feeling weight in the chest. For a long time, that kiss had been remembered as mistake, activation, trigger, loaded with guilt and excessive responsibility, the instant something old awakened. But emotional maturity offered a wider, fairer reading. The kiss wasn't the problem. The kiss was only a human gesture, legitimate, sincere, full of real intention. What gave it disproportionate weight was the place where it happened and the emotional structure that waited for it. The narrator finally understood. Love doesn't create prisons. Structures built around love, out of fear of losing it, do. That understanding was freeing. The narrator began to see how, throughout life, many kisses carry invisible expectations, implicit promises, quiet attempts to secure permanence. The mansion had only made visible what usually stays internal, the human desire to freeze the moment before it escapes. The difference now was that the narrator could kiss without trying to hold the future inside that gesture. Kiss without demanding guarantees. Kiss while accepting that the value of the moment is precisely that it cannot be eternalized without becoming a prison. The love lived after the mansion never had the feverish intensity of the past, and rather than loss, it became gain. It was a love that breathed, adapted, didn't need to be proven daily, a love that knew it could end and still chose to exist. There was one specific simple moment when the narrator realized the story had finally closed completely. It was an ordinary night, no special wind, no loaded silence. The narrator woke briefly, looked around, and felt only human presence. No expectation, no vigilance, no comparison to old ghosts. And in that instant, the narrator understood something essential. True peace makes no noise. The mansion now existed only as an internal narrative, a story told to oneself when needed, to remember what not to repeat. It had fulfilled its role not as a cursed place, but as an extreme mirror of an emotional behavior that had to be seen in order to be outgrown. The narrator never returned to that house, not out of fear, not out of excessive reverence, simply because there was nothing left to resolve there. Everything that needed ending had been ended at the right moment, with the right gesture, and that brought a final understanding, maybe the most important one. Not every love needs to last forever to justify its existence. Some loves exist to teach exactly why they must not last. The original woman, the mansion, the cycle, the kiss, everything came to live inside the narrator as parts of a single lesson. A lesson about boundaries, about goodbyes, about the danger of turning memory into demand, about the beauty of letting things end. In the end, the narrator understood the true opposite of love isn't the end, it's captivity. And to love fully requires courage not only to stay, but to leave when it's necessary. The story ended without a bang, without late revelation, without unexpected return. It ended the way stories that truly change someone end, with enough silence for the learning to keep echoing, because some mansions don't need to be demolished, they only need to stop being inhabited by fear, and some kisses don't need to be forgotten, they only need to be freed from the weight of lasting forever.